class at Hongik University in Seoul, Korea in 2018. During her time there, she participated in an international exchange student program with California State University and received numerous awards, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs honor by the Korean government. In 2020, Ara received an MFA in ceramic art from the New York State College of Ceramics at the infamous Alfred University. Ara has participated in numerous exhibitions around the United States and in South Korea and received several awards, including most recently in 2020, first place at the Great Outdoors Juried Exhibition hosted at Medford Art Center in New Jersey. She also received an honorable mention at the Art Show International in Los Angeles, California in 2021. Her most recent exhibition was a solo show titled Minute Landscapes, hosted at the Cluster Gallery in Brooklyn, New York. Her works are collected by Alfred Ceramic Art Museum, Daikyo Culture Foundation, Wynell Corporation, and many other personal collections. Currently, she is a resident artist at the District Clay Center in Washington, D.C., where among other projects, she helps coordinate the Community Clay Project, which brings free clay and ceramic classes to the youth of DC with a focus on Ward 7 and 8. This is how I met Ara when delivering a clay donation from Marymount University to the District Clay Center to contribute to the program. And since then, I've stayed in contact with her, where I was introduced to her high level of intellect and fascinating sculpture work. She's also just a pleasure to be around. So this is why I'm excited to introduce Ara. And without further ado, I will hand the reins over to Ara. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe, for introduction. I'll share my screen real quick. Is everybody seeing my screen okay? And I sound okay? Great. Thank you, Joe, for the fancy introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Ara Ko. I currently live in DC and a resident artist at District Clay Center in northeastern DC. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral and traditional land of Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Picasaway people. And today I'm going to share about my work, but also I thought about what students might want to listen during this class time. And I kind of tracked back to myself as an undergrad and asked myself, what was I so curious about at the time? And back then I didn't really know what lies ahead of me or, even what I'm going to have for lunch that day. So I'm just going to share my experience of how, why, and when I made my career decisions. And hopefully that could be helpful to the Marymount students whenever you think you need to make that type of decisions like me. So to start off, quick background about myself. I was born and raised in Seoul, South Korea. I grew up in a very artsy setting. My mom on the right is a fashion designer, and my dad on the left is a product designer. I don't know, I'm crying in that picture, but growing up, I somehow knew that I'm gonna end up in an art-related field, and I decided to go to art school. And it was quite coincidental how I got into clay. That's me in clay, literally in clay. And in Korea, when you declare your major before you apply to college, so it's not like you're applying to Marymount, it's like you're applying to Marymount Ceramics. And at the time, my dad taught in my undergrad in the industrial design program, and his colleagues came over for dinner. They had a little more than they should have drunk. They got real drunk. And one guy came up to me. He's still a very famous designer in Korea. He told me, Ara, you should just major in ceramics because ceramics have future. And I was stupid enough to listen to a drunk product designer, and I thought, okay, yeah, sure. All right. So then I majored in ceramics in college, and somehow that ended up here. But yeah, I didn't really thought I was gonna be a ceramic artist. I thought I'm gonna be an artist or a designer or somehow become like a magazine reporter for arts. But that really got me excited about clay in my sophomore year. So my whole college experience was a mess. Everything that I made in my freshman year or sophomore year, it all blew up in the kiln. Everything that I had made had cracks, and I just hated ceramics. And I wrote an application to change my major into art history. And then in my sophomore year, my teacher, Engine, took me to Alfred University, summer workshop program. So I participated in Alfred summer workshops in 2016, which I when I was a sophomore. My teacher brought like 20-ish people from Korea. I think, yeah, it was 20-ish people from Korea every summer. And I saw that posting on the wall and it said Alfred, New York. So I thought, hey, I worked really hard to go to this college and I deserve a trip to New York City. And if I say it's for ceramic thing and it's educational, so maybe my parents might pay for it. So at the time, I didn't really realize how big New York was. Alfred University is located in the Western New York, which is really out of nowhere and nobody knows. And New York State is about like 1.5 times bigger than South Korea. So that means if I drive from Buffalo to New York City, I'll be in North Korea, in Korean Peninsula. So I was really shocked that Alfred was really that rural, and it was 5 hour drive from New York City. And growing all my life in Seoul, and especially in like the intense city like area, for me, New York City doesn't feel that busy to me. So Alfred was a big shock. I still hated Alfred and I was just so ready to go to New York City and have good time and maybe go shopping, go to see the museums and go do exciting stuff. And this thing happened. So this was titled Cascade. It was made in the summer of 2016 at the Alfred Summer Workshop. I took a sculptural raw clay class with Walter McConnell, and this piece I built inside of the gallery on a gallery named Robert C. Turner Gallery, and it's made of wooden armature, and I stuck raw clay on top of it, and I left it unfired. So whenever I show this piece, many people ask me like, "Oh, Ara, like, how'd you fire it?" And it's really interesting to me that I have to always explain to them that this is not fired. That notion and this class especially really changed my life, that I really saw what clay could offer, that clay is just so much more than clay or ceramics or pottery. Clay was earth, and I saw this new horizon that this class really opened up my eyes about how versatile clay could be, how this really plastic thing in my hand that I literally could do anything with. And then I went back to Korea later that summer and I immediately called the art history department that I want to withdraw from their major, whatever, I'm going to stay in ceramics. And I realized I just hated homework and deadlines and the pressure that was under me at school. And I didn't really hate it clay. That was a big thing. And starting from that piece, in terms of my work, I mainly work in installation in terms of raw clay experience or any fired ones too. Installation really reflects my curiosity to alter, change up, and maybe fight with a space character and flow. And I really like that it could shape, my installation could shape the area and like the aura around the space, that it really plays a crucial role in employing the space where the work is placed, and also with the process of making for me as a maker, and how the viewer walk around and the time they experience walking around or just seeing the work. This piece is called Rare Momentum, made in the second semester of my grad school. That was year 2019. And really, I just mentioned it too, but really my body of work has two different methods of making in terms of process. So one is fired and one is unfired work. And I think the reason why I'm starting with this work or this unfired work is because this is like the reason why I started clay. Wet clay really liberates from kiln limitations, either size or shape or sometimes gravity. I'm pretty sure students who have worked with clay making sculpture or even pottery, when you want to make something big or something that has a challenging shape, or sometimes your piece just gives in to gravity. And wet clay experience really liberated me from that the process being so visible really brought its intimacy to me. And as you see in the picture, the touch, the impression of the material is the work itself. That my time is translated into visual. And I always thought wet clay is really sensual and sensory, that I really have to engage bodily. It's not just working with my fingers, just smoothing out the coils or working with the slab, but I really have to get my body in there to make this work happen. And for me, the whole process, or just seeing the work after it's done, is very cathartic. It's the rock clay work is really against the conventional ceramic process in a way of firing bisque glaze and glaze firing it. But in a way, this is a very primitive way of art. This is what the cave people must have done back in the Neolithic days. And at the end of the day, I'm a ceramic artist too. Vitrification or firing is also important to me, that it brings a different sense to the work. It transformed the work beyond its visual. Fired clay has this sense of maturity or durability or some sort of transition. But for me, wet clay experience and fired clay experience means something more than what it's seen. So this is the dried up version of the same work. And I always thought there was a fine line between sensual and neurotic. And I always thought wet clay was on that line. And after seeing my work dried up, it really got me into question, like, why do I see it erotic? And in my undergrad statement, I wrote, clay and I exchange moisture. I absorb clay's body moisture, and clay absorbs my body moisture. Clay stiffens up as I touch, and the temperature of my body solidifies clay. I worded clay out as he, as my romantic partner, since I'm a heterosexual female, but I still have not figured out where clay lies in that sentence. Or it's really hard to see why clay is so erotic or sensual to me when the piece is so dry like this. So I'm still trying to answer the question about that, but this is kind of like an open-ended question for me. So I just wanted to bring it up to you guys, because that's the thing that I'm constantly thinking from my undergrad till now. And I'm gonna set the tone a little different here from this one. This one's from my undergrad. And yesterday I had a pleasure of the collector of this piece sent me a picture of my work installed in a corporate lobby. And it was a very interesting experience just to revisit my work via photo with yeah, with the installation shot that people walk by, at least like 200-300 people every day would walk by, and that was really something to see. And so anyways, about my work is very repetitive, either by numbers or size. My sculptures call for presence, and it almost looks like a confrontation to the work. And there's this intensity of labor, repetitiveness, or some people even call it kind of obsessive. And I think my work insists on being physically challenging to make for the maker, which is myself. And there are no shortcuts or easy ways to get around it. I can't ask assistants to make it because it looks very different too. Um, and somehow that physical burden, it really ties me down because at the end of the day, I'm one person. I could only work so much in a day, but it plays a big part in my studio practice because it really claims the authority of space. Like when you install a piece in a space, installation claims space and the space kind of shows itself. But when I'm making, I have nothing. I have nothing that I could see. I have nothing that I could touch. So I think me wanting to see it, really feel it, touch it, and grab it is the reason why I work with such a big numbers or size. And in my undergrad statement, I also wrote, in process, I face my most candid self. I think that sentence is like the best thing I did in my undergrad for 4 years, that this still applies true to me, that my work is very repetitive. And in the time of process that I'm making, I have no emotions at all. That I don't feel negative. I don't think about like, oh, what kind of lunch am I going to have today? Like, I don't think about those. And I could solely rely on my work for that time. And I I still think that making becomes like a vehicle for understanding identity for myself, that my work is a visual representation of my identity, and it kind of confirms owing my identity that this is what I believe in. And it kind of feels like as if the work is saying, here I am, this is my space, and this is who I am. And I believe that agency kind of proclaims myself as an artist. It's about being a person of a color. It's being a female maker in the early 21st century. And this obsessiveness, ambition, or intensity gained by gained by the repetition or the size is about my work being connected to myself and kind of proclaiming this my significance as a person, that my body of work is kind of like me stepping into power. And as my sculpture claims space, I'm claiming my position of authority, the space that's kind of my own space, that I call it my own. And my work kind of marks the beginning of me as a woman. And especially um, with racial injustice and sexism, it really echoes a lot to me personally, because in grad school, I was asked one question about, I'm not gonna drop the name, but he asked me a question like, Ara, your works are always big or too many. Have you ever thought about that as a stupid power? And I asked myself, yeah, maybe it could be stupid power because it really hurts my back and it hurts my um, arms and my whole body. After I leave the studio, I always ache. And I thought, that's true. That could be a stupid power. But I think I'm just shouting out to the world that I'm a woman, I'm capable of doing this. And if you see this work and think it's a stupid power, then you got to change how you think about work, because there are certain things that only a big scale work could do, or either this work has to be this big or this many that to give the message that I really want to give. And the question that I'm always asking myself right now is how much is too much, and how do I find the balance in between? That's something that I'm tackling on right now, and I'm going to touch on that a little later. But right now, um, this is upstate New York. I took this picture in Alfred on the morning walk or run. Um, I'm really interested in space, that how that spatial experience does to human being, more connected to the viewer. And I think this sense came from this scenery of upstate New York in grad school. This is Alfred in Google Maps. It's all green, and it's very different from my growing up or upbringing, which is very city-like, and it was very busy and bustling. And I was born and raised in Seoul, and this is a picture of Seoul. Seoul is home of 9.8 million people. It's a huge metropolis where skyscrapers and high-tech industry meet Buddhist temples or ancient palace. And a lot of time frames, very different time frames coexist within the architecture of the city. So in this picture, you would be able to notice there's cityscape and landscape kind of overlapping on each other. And I grew up in this neighborhood within like a landscape of tall, rectangular, box-shaped apartment complexes within like the diminished green surfaces. Like you walk around Seoul for 5 minutes, you could see ancient palace, and when you turn around, you'll see American embassy, a giant American embassy. That's how Seoul looks like. And this is the exact neighborhood where I grew up in Seoul. I lived in one of those tiny boxes, and after moving to Alfred, really made me realize, wow, I lived in such a planned city, that what I believed in as a landscape is actually just cityscape, and it's not really a landscape. And the landscapes that I know of is might be wrong from like the definition in the dictionary. And this is the reaction of me about that weird transition from Saul to Alfred, that in common sense, people live inside of a building, architecture, and then architecture is cited in landscape. And so I thought architecture and landscape kind of holds humanity. And coming to Alfred, filled with those so many trees and mountains and deer encounters, really showed me something that, like, can this order be reversed? Can landscape live inside of architecture, and like in Seoul, and maybe architecture in people? So this was my reaction to, if architecture holds the landscape, then what would human react to this? Because the viewer would walk into the gallery and see this and think about, oh, then can I hold the landscape in myself? So I treated these sculptures as vessels, a vessel that has a possibility of holding something. So all my sculptures are empty. It is a sculpture, but I just like to call it empty, and also think about the vacancy and what the vacancy could mean to a broader audience. Like some people, nobody would react to this as like, oh, that's a giant cheese plate. Nobody's gonna react that way. But I just wanted them to have a feeling of a sculpture could be a vessel. And um, especially from this piece, just walking around, I kind of dreamed about my body, my physical self being contained in spaces that where I was raised in Seoul. And I thought about my body as a vessel, and I'm just enveloping and putting all the information, or like the atmosphere of the area that I grew up in. And I think that's the reason why the imagery of mountain landscape really frequents in my work through color or pattern. And this was another piece that I did in grad school. I actually wanted to ask myself, maybe I should make something that really looks like the apartment complex that I grew up in. And this was the reaction to that. And I started thinking about materials like, is glaze necessary? Like, is glaze firing or high firing or even glaze itself, is it necessary in my sculpture? Because sometimes it could be really irrelevant. And this was the reaction that I started glazing everything with baking soda, that I don't really have to mix up a glaze. I was a big glaze nerd in undergrad, but I just wanted to do something different. I just poured baking soda all over my piece and started to fire high fire. And after that, I started to unglaze my piece and leave it at the BIS fire temperature. This work is called Core Samples. This was supposed to be for my thesis show, but was canceled by COVID. But it's very big. It's confrontational. It's very figurative through a relational scale, that each of the pieces' footprint corresponds to the length of my feet and the width of my shoulder. And I kind of made this thinking about, okay, if I were to walk around the high skyscrapers, then I want to make the cutouts of those mountains cut out by the tall skyscraper buildings. So in a way, they kind of meet at a certain point. But I thought that comes to me as a spatial experience of Seoul. But what really interested me is that when people saw this in Alfred, they thought of a lot about like American West, like Southern Utah or the Death Valley. And I think it's coming from the color, but it was very interesting to me how someone's personal experience of a city in East Asia could be translated into some other viewers' imagery of those American West. That was very interesting to me. Like, that's another question that I'm trying to ask myself as well. But going back to my work, the imagery of landscape is still there as swelling bands of color through, it looks like a color or sometimes even looks like a pattern. And I think my sculpture to be as a cast of my body's externals, like my physical measurements, but it's also a cast of experience that it's kind of internalized, like the landscapes that I remember in my head, the landscape that I remember in Seoul. And this is like my artistic goal, not making this piece, but thinking about having my personal um, experience to be translated into visual, and somehow that could be extended to viewer's body. But I said the word installation so many times already, and I see my sculptures as a whole as an installation. But before I say installation, I treat installation as a scenery. So in my thesis, I wrote, I draw in space, I sculpt the air, I'm shaping the tonalities of space around the work. I set the tone of my work, I set the temperature of my work, and I create an atmosphere where the viewer breathes in. So there are a lot of artists out there calling installation and calling themselves installation artists after throwing like 5,000 beats on the floor and call it installations. And personally, I'm humiliated by that notion. And that's the reason why I always try to be aware when I'm using the word installation. It's because I think installation has to do with like very different things than just arrangements. That installation has elements, that it has to do with space around the work, the maybe pedestal if there is any, or where the work sits. Is it sitting on the floor? Is it sitting on the pedestal? And the artwork itself, but most importantly, the viewer. Like, if viewer walks into the gallery and see the work, they're gonna give some sort of an impression. And if the artist throws the bead again in a different gallery, I feel like it should be different because it's a different space. And for many artists, it is really not. And for me, this is how I kind of define my installation. I could be wrong too. That the arrangement or the scenery should somehow have a rhythm that releases the time. Like when viewer walks around my work, they kind of have to remember the work in such a different impressions. Like it really lives in the experience of people, that the space, the weight of the piece, gravity and the process, and how time evokes imagery, that installation really compels viewers to see it in a multiple points of view. Like one scene might seem familiar, but in a different angle or upstairs, another viewpoint could be a little foreign depending on the viewer. And I thought that really makes the meaning of installation, and that's kind of like how I define my installation and my outlook on space. And yeah, those are the things that I was really interested in grad school. And seeing this piece really tears my heart because I'm not able to touch these work, or I got kicked out during COVID because of all the government orders and everything. And this piece made me reflect a lot about my grad school experience while putting together these slides for this lecture. And it touched me a lot about my studio practice, but also something about my personal life, that I never saw this piece in person. This was the piece that was sent to me by the school gallery who put together all the mock-up thesis show. And it is bitter that till this day that I've never seen the whole installation. I always took a picture of each one and then Photoshop to see the whole thing. I wasn't able to touch my graduation certificate. This is my parents holding my graduation certificate. That it feels really surreal, but at the same time during the lockdown, I started making pots. I thought in undergrad, I thought, no, I'm gonna be an artist. I'm making raw clay sculpture. Like, no, I'm not potter. And I kind of shut myself down from pottery. But it was a I think it was a big turning point in my work because I started this off because I was going insane in my apartment. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in Alfred, and there was really nobody outside but deers, and I had nothing to do at home. I fortunately brought like 6 bags of clay. I started making pots at home, and at first it was kind of like art therapy, that I could touch something at home and I could still feel like I'm being productive. And it really changed my studio practice as well, that if this means something to me and if this is used in someone else's life, then scale doesn't really matter. That I'm going back to that stupid power thing again, but I'm thinking about, why does my work have to be so big? I get it. It has to be with like women, and it has to be my authority of space or whatever. And now I'm thinking back, like if it's still small and usable or not, if it's still small and if I could portray the same message, then it could be productive as well. So in response to that, this was the piece that I sent it out to my solo show in New York. This was up in the gallery in January till like last week. This last weekend, I went to New York City to deinstall the show, and I'm in quarantine right now. But this was the response to why the work has to be so big, and what happens to my work if I bring my work into the traditional sculpture size. Like if my work is on a plinth or a pedestal, does that is that a less of an art because it's so small? And from this work, I learned that it's not. And I'm trying out all different sorts of stuff. Like I'm trying out different things that I weren't able to do in grad school. I'm mixing clay powder, the kaolin powder, with gesso, and started painting these textures. And um, I'm trying out different cold finishes, like this on front. This is bisque fired, where then I applied heavy coat of epoxy glossy paint on top, and I'm just trying different thing. But really my question goes out to this, that the size matter, and if the size doesn't matter to me, then what is a good size for me, or is there a good size for me? And those are the questions that I've been asking myself a lot lately. So yeah, those, I feel like I just gave tons of questions to everyone that I'm thinking about, but I'm more than happy to answer your questions as well. And if you could answer my questions, that'd be awesome. And here's my Instagram handle, and the works are that big. That's me. And my website if you want to reach out to me. And yeah, thank you for listening for such a long time.
All right, thanks, Ara. That was a fantastic presentation. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I don't have any right now from the audience, but I might have a couple. I actually had a bunch of questions, but you had answered them for me in your presentation. So I was trying to be quick on the spot, but one of the things that I had recognized was you have this certain relationship with clay and the material, this like human versus nature and material. And I see this in a lot of your work, the first pieces with your hands, where that was like a sensual experience that you're sharing with the material. Then that goes into the columns and the landscape structures, between the human architecture versus natural architecture. I guess what I'm getting at is, is your relationship with clay, is it a reaction to your did you choose to use clay as more of a pragmatic material that you're interested in? Or are these are did you arrive at using clay because you understood these metaphors that you were trying to understand and found that that was the best material to use for your process? Could you just go into those types of choices a little bit?
Yeah, I think sorry. I think it has more to do with your second statement, that I just found clay to be related to the area that I was interested in. And sometimes I leave this aside, this statement aside, but I'm Catholic. I grew up Catholic, and being Catholic is one of the things that really constructed me as a person. And in the Bible it says men are made in clay, men are made from earth. So I thought earth is the best material to portray humanity. That was the first reason why. But also a biggest point for me as an artist is that ceramic process, or maybe it does not really apply to rock clay, but it has to do with like the five elements in the world, like in Korean or East Asian principles, that there's five elements in the world, that is metal, air, water, fire, and earth. And somehow ceramic material had all that five elements. When I pushed that thing into the kiln, it has water and clay, because you have to make a clay body, and it has to dry with air. You need fire to fire. And after you fire the ceramic piece, it becomes like this metallic thing. Like even when you put iron oxide in your glaze, it's a metallic thing that had just been transformed through the vitrification. But That's another thing that I've noticed, that if clay experience or clay making experience could kind of describe the humanity by itself and how this world just revolves around, then there's this enigma by itself that I don't even have to explain. And that kind of made sense for me, that this is the reason why I work with clay. So maybe this could be an excuse because I'm trying different mediums at home and working on other stuff too. But that was the reason why I chose clay to be that material. And I thought that reflected a lot about the subject matter that I'm dealing with. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm listening and I'm now getting a bunch of questions, so I'm starting to have to do two things at once here. I guess there's a couple people asking the same question, and uh, it deals more with like the thinness. So the thin question that's, sorry, do the big box sculptures have thicker walls at the bottom? Are the crossing walls part of the structural support? I believe we're getting in some real technical questions. So maybe you could just speak to the technical elements of your work.
That's so funny that every artist talk or whenever I show, everybody asks me like, can I touch it? Like, how is that so thin? And yes, it is thicker at the bottom, but I'm kind of disguising it so that wherever the edges are seen, I'm making it thinner. So it's not that different, but from the bottom, it gradually goes up, up, up and gets thinner. And crossing walls are really not a structural support. They're not, they might be doing a structural support, but I think from like only the structural support walls that you see are only from like the third top from the piece. So it's not really a structural support because it's just for the show.
And then there's some questions, and this kind of goes along with, what I wanted to try and bring into the conversation. We have a lot of international students at Marymount, and I was going to ask how, the importance of your international exchanges and those cultural exchanges, and how that, helped your development as a professional, or how that, gave you opportunities and led to the professional choices that you're making. And someone to just build on that a little bit, as an international student, this is from Azaya. As an international student, I also got very interested in a language. She expresses her work in secondary language, English. Could you talk a little bit how you learned the language and got able to talk at this level? So I guess it's just kind of more of an encompassing, like international type of experience.
Yeah, I was in the United States. My mom really wanted me to speak good English, so she sent me to summer camps, like going to the pool and everything in the United States and Canada. So she sent me to US in a very early age so that I could learn English. So thank you, Mom. And but speaking about art in a second language is very different. Like I learned English from a very young age. I started speaking English right after I started speaking Korean. So that was a huge advantage for me. But when you think about it, all the words that I use today are learned after like secondary education, like in college or maybe in high school. And for me, the biggest fear coming to grad school was that I never talked about art in English. I always talked about my art in Korean, and how am I gonna say that? And um, my teacher in grad school, John Gill, told me maybe that could be your advantage because you don't know how to speak. So you have to really think about it when you say something. And that was completely right. That whenever I wanted to say something, I want to make sure this is the thing that I want to say. And I have experience of working as a translator. And when I was an undergrad as like a side hustle, um, that I care too much about if this word is the right word for my work. So when I word something out, I read the dictionary. Like even though I know the word mountain or landscape, I double check so that if this is the thing that I really want to say to other people, but also it's more like double checking with myself. Is this the thing that you want to say to other people? And that kind of constructed my work a little better because I have to think again and just think like, okay, what if it's this? It could be this word, and maybe if that word's better, then my practice changed too. So me being a foreigner or being a Korean and have speaking English as a second language maybe benefited me a little bit. It's definitely hard. It's definitely hard because you have to read so much and you want to take in information from American culture too, and it's difficult. But there is also always a benefit to that side too. So I thank my mom a lot.
If I could build off that, I what I found really interesting about language is that you discover how other cultures kind of organize ideas and organize language to fit their understanding of the world. And so I guess, and because some of your work also, bridges the gap between your South Korean experience and your American experience. I was wondering if, your understanding of these languages or different cultures have brought you some clarity or brought you complexity in understanding the work that you're doing, and, whether or not, having those experiences, it was really beneficial in understanding where your work is coming from.
Definitely, the body of work that I did in grad school was brought by the change of sceneries. That was just I was just visually starstruck. That was the first thing. But I think what I'm interested in right now is that it seems like locations really affect my work a lot. That moving to Alfred was a big thing, and I moved to DC like last July, and it's only been like half a year now. So I'm really excited to see how that affects my work now. That my solo show title is called Minute Landscape. That I thought, well, DC is kind of like Seoul. It has more parks, but DC is kind of like Seoul, and I'm just still curious how I'm gonna react to that because I always react to my work after I make certain stuff. It doesn't come out to me until I finish the work. And me just sitting down for like 2 hours and thinking about my work, like why did I make that? And like where is those lines or those colors coming from? So even my work from like 4 or 5 years ago, sometimes I cannot really answer. But I'm excited to see what comes out. And I'm sorry, did I answer your question or I was kind of floating off?
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, it's an abstract question too. So, yeah, I was just, I think you answered it pretty well. Um, there's one more question that kind of from one of our viewers, from Bob Donahue, and it kind of also relates to what I was hoping maybe you could possibly finish on. And his question directly is what is the biggest thing you keep dreaming of making? And I think that's interesting because you talked about your experience with the stupid power and how scale was so important to you, and you finished your slideshow with works in that you were scaling down, and whether or not that was based on you know your ability to have access to large spaces or not, right, because of the pandemic, and what that experience gave you, and how that offered you a possible new understanding of how important scale could be. And I guess my overall question would, could you just speak to your general direction and where you think you're going? Does scale really matter to you anymore? Is that really a significant part of your work?
I think number one, scale matters a lot. And even till this day, like before the lecture, I was scribbling on my notepad. I want to make this big, and I was thinking about size and thinking about kiln limitations and how I should cut my piece to make this big thing. And Bob's question, the biggest thing that I dream of making is something like Kaneko sculpture. Like I'm not aware, I don't know how many people are aware of Kaneko, but um I always got uh comments about me being feminist Sarah, and I don't know why, but I was always opposed to that statement. And I thought maybe I'm like opposed to feminist Sarah because I just don't like Sarah as a person. Like I love his art, but not him as a person. Not that I know him personally, but and I also thought like I just don't want to be like a replica of someone who's already famous and become like a cop out. And Kaneko was kind of like an answer to the question. Like Kaneko and Isamu Noguchi is like my two go-to artists that when I'm stuck, I just look at their work and it's so beautiful and I get inspirations from them. And I got a lot of inspiration from Kaneko that his works are rather very, very big, sometimes big that even trucks cannot handle his work. And I thought about my work that it's not big enough. Like it is big. It is big for sure compared to other people, but it's not big enough for me. That I feel like I could go bigger. And I feel like I could fill up like a whole room with like teeny tiny petals, or I could try building like a whole building with my sculpture. Like if I have armatures and I could do something with so much space. So I think I really want to make bigger, just like the logistics of me right now is kind of like tying everything down. And it takes money too. And that's like one reason why, but I would love to make it big. Like I don't think I have limitations for big, but I think I do have limitation for small because it was so painstakingly hard for me to size down. I had to think so much, and because I was so used to making multiples, it was really hard for me to just make one good thing that's small enough that I could carry. That was really hard. Um, Pottery, making cups or plates was a little easier because I knew it had to have a function and it doesn't function if it like goes over the scale. So it was easier for me to think about it, but small scale was so hard because sculpture could be big and I'm just trying to limit this in a box. And like I said, I don't like deadlines or homeworks. Like I don't like limitations. So that was really hard, but I'm learning a lot from that process that limiting down myself makes me think more about the angles or shapes or the size or elements that I'm putting into this limited space, and thinking about not about like how many or how small, but am I overdoing it? Like am I overdoing the surface, like, or am I underdoing the surface? Because when I had that sculpture that I showed you for the Brooklyn show poster, after I glaze fired it, it was a big disappointment. I didn't like it at all. So I started going to art stores all around DC and just walk around and see if they have anything. And I just immediately grabbed the gilding petals, like the gold foil paper, so that I could gild on top. And till this day, I don't know if that was the perfect finish for the piece, but I think that was the thing that I could have done at that point. But I feel like it could be something different. So sizing down is really hard. To go back to your question, building big is not hard at all. People think building big is hard, but it's not at all.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Kaneko, because earlier in your presentation, and you're talking about scale and space in between and relationships, and I really went to Jun Kaneko because, you know, a lot of that's really what his work is all about. And it's interesting too that, you know, you're talking about scale and technical difficulties. And I mean, my students are aware of his work because normally they're writing essays on Jun Kaneko. um, um, but I've introduced them to an article where, you know, his one of his first really large Dango series that toured around, he partnered with a brick company and built everything inside of the kilns and used cranes and this type of thing. And it's interesting to hear you go through, you know, the problem solving, you know, experience as far as process concerned, you know, where it's easier for you to make larger things than it is for you to make smaller things. And, you know, it's also interesting too, with just thinking about your final slides and how you were, you know, struggling to work inside the pandemic and scale down. And I noticed that your sculptures almost became vessel-like and then became glazed. And so it's also, I'm also really interested in how, like, you had this mediary sculpture where you said it wasn't very successful and you had to change it on the fly. But then those really small, like little cup sculptures were just really, really beautiful pieces. And I'm wondering, you know, is it that experience of having that intermediate, you know, sculpture project where then you landed down to this more vessel work where glaze became an obvious finish? Is, you know, could you talk about that perhaps? Did I ask a question clear enough where you could?
Yeah, you're totally right. I was laughing because that was my exact thinking process. um, the sculpture that was on the Brooklyn show poster, I just started off building a just a cylinder with coils, and I started to punch here and there, and then I saw it needs some wings, like handles. And if you remember the picture of my cup, it's not a handle that you could put your um fingers through. It's just like a thin slab. And yeah, that cup idea gave me that, oh, this needs a wing, and then like maybe a wing there, and I'll just puncture it through. That's how I work. That's how I work. Like sometimes, like those core samples, the pillar ones, I have image in mind, and I have like an inspiration that it's coming from, and I need that to be certain height. I need that to be a certain size. I asked my studio friends to measure my shoulder and my feet so that I could like really make that happen. But so it had all the planning involved for that sculpture because I knew that it's going to be big. I didn't really know how many I'm going to make, but I kind of felt like, okay, I need that size. But for the gilded vessel, the winged Brooklyn sculpture was really just a involuntary experience of like, this needs this, and this screams out for violet, so maybe I glaze it violet. And I learned this really amazing technique from my grad school colleague Chinchik. He's this year's NCCA Emerging Artist, but his original major was visual graphic design, so he's really good with Photoshop. And when I was having a hard time with what's the right color for my sculpture in grad school, he took a picture of my work, and then he put it on a Photoshop and started to like rotate the color wheel on top of my sculpture. And I was like, oh my God, nothing fits. I hate all of them. And then I started glazing, not to glaze, but I did that for my winged sculpture. I saw white with gray, so I glazed it white and gray in terms of that. And it has a subtle hue of like aquamarine or a little bit of violet, but I just added that because I felt like I need some rhythm in there, something that changes up a little bit so that it doesn't look so plain and boring. And yeah, that's the reason why I glazed it. It's really, you kind of already said how I started to glaze my piece, so I can't really add too much to that. But yeah, I did a little bit of Photoshop on my work, and I'm hoping that someday I don't really have to take a picture in Photoshop. Like maybe like if I see the work, I would just have a color in my mind. That's
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your you going through process and choices. And one of the things that, I try to teach my students is, it's okay to experiment, it's okay to fail, and that you shouldn't have so much emphasis on one particular piece. It's about this large group of experiments. And I appreciate that, even an artist of your experience continues to go through those types of experiences. And I can say, my experience is I'm constantly battling those types of things. And I guess I'd like to just backtrack a little bit and touch on, how that somewhat relates to your expressiveness. Like you have a sense of expressive nature in the making of your work. And I really think about like the larger raw pieces of clay, how you're using your hands and your finger marks, and how you're having this really, it seems like a very energetic and intimate experience with the material, and how that literally relates to what we refer to as expressionism. Um, and you kind of mentioned how you were making choices with your little cups, and you're like, hey, a little wing needs to go there. And I'm curious as to how, whether or not you feel like, traditional expressionism as like a mode of making, whether or not you favor, if you're thinking about that, or whether it's, more of an experimentation. Are you looking at it more of like a philosophical incorporation into your work, or is it more of just like your process of experimenting new ideas? Could you just maybe on that?
yeah. Before grad school or even during grad school, I just said, oh, it's very intuitive work. Like it's my intuition. But now I hate to say the word intuition. Maybe I just got really picky about words, but I feel like the word intuition is just like giving up on your work. Like I don't really have any comment to say, so I'll just say intuition. Like I just really hated that notion that I'm just giving up on my sculpture. Like if I'm not going to say anything about it, then who's going to be a supporter of it? Like so I'm thinking it has a lot of factors in there. Like sometimes it's just a formative decision that I feel like this side needs a little bit more to balance that side, so I'll add something there. And it could be like a reference from art history. Like it could be coming from like Korean what is it, the celadon jars that has a lot of like decorations, or like the foot, or like the lid. Like it's not really visible there, but sometimes when I think about balance, I think about like, okay, some Korean like horse ewer thingy, they look very weird, but somehow they look very poised and balanced. Like, how did they do it? And then I would go to the picture and look at it and like, oh, maybe the head and the tail, it has more weight to it. So I get like hints for that as well. Or I think about like when I mentioned the vacancy, it was coming from like a book that I was reading. Um, it was about like catastrophe, or like it was really a bad book. I don't really remember, but it was about how people are really attracted to loss, someone's loss. Like when there's like a wildfire going on, like they want to see it. Like, oh, California burned down, I want to see it. And I just like look through the pictures. Or if somebody had a big car accident on 405, then you want to see that thing happen. Like how did that run over? Like And I thought about like I consider vessels as vacant so that it has possibility to hold, but at the same time people could see it as empty, and like my sculpture could be just like a wrapped over. So I think about those stuff from the books as well. So I get a lot of references from here and there, but I could say that it's not just simple intuition that, oh, it just popped into my head and it goes there, because I want to know where it comes from. And now I have no excuse to give, because whenever I add something to the cup, I know that it's a slab and it's going to perform as a handle, but it's going to be a decoration. So it kind of goes through my head like that.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. There's one more. It looks like there's one more question that just popped in. And this goes back to referencing when it was right after you were speaking about Jen Kaneko, you had mentioned an artist um, who, and Eric Bradshaw writes, I think you mentioned someone you said you didn't like, but you like the art of. What is your view of almost separating art from the artist, or getting inspired by artists that we may not necessarily see as someone we should support?
Um, I mentioned Sarah. I like his work, but
Mm,
some of his work I don't like. Um, and I'm not gonna talk about Sarah, but I'm gonna talk about my few friends from the clay community. People say clay people are the nicest people on earth, but it's not. Some people are that nice. And I started seeing, because my friends are artists too. Like sometimes I really like him or her as a person, but I just don't like their work. Or sometimes the work is really great, but the person's not really great. Like, so that's the start of me thinking art and the person is kind of separate. But at the same time, when you look at some established potters, like I think especially potters, the personality kind of reflects the work, or the work reflects the personality. Like, I guess I could take an example of Linda Sorman. She's very energetic in person. That when I had her for a studio visit for half an hour, I was drowned. I was drowned after half an hour conversation. Her work is super energetic. You see all the energy and the strength coming in from the work. Like, if I take Matt Kelleher, he's very poised. He's a good listener. His pod is a really good listener. His pod is there to serve. I'm not saying Matt is there to serve, but his pod is there to serve and be used. Like, it's ready. Like the pod is ready to be serve its function. And I've started noticing that. And I've started noticing that like the people that I like personally and like the work as well are tend to be more successful than the people who don't really match up their work. Like sometimes it has to do with like my personal aesthetical choices too. Like I just don't like poppy colors. Like maybe that's another reason. But I think it has to do with how honest you are to your work. Like how much of you, how are you giving yourself to the work is, I think, is honesty. And if I don't see that, then I feel like sometimes it's hard to support their art or themselves. So yeah, that's kind of like how I started seeing art and the person separate. And another thing was I saw an artist who is like a mid Korean Trump supporter. Like he was a very famous sculptor who taught me in my undergrad as a sculpture minor. He was like the hero of our undergrad. He was the most famous sculptor in Korea. That he made like many like historical statues in the center of like City Plaza. And then he like had like a news interview saying like I support this person, and like politically, and I was like, ew, disgusted. Like, and then I had this big hit in the head, like, oh my god, he's established, but he is supporting like a different political figure than who I support, and he's still kind of cool. Like, how do I deal with that? So there, I guess I should say that my formula is not always right, but like Sarah as well. But yeah, I don't know if that answered question, but I think everybody have different points of view, and for me, it's about honesty.
Yeah, I'd like to build on your honesty. I found honesty in your work is a really important thing. It's kind of what I try to stay focused on, especially, you see the latest magazine cover of like Ceramics Monthly, and there's like all this cool stuff, and you're like, oh, that's what people like right now. Or, I've been in numerous craft shows, and people, and I do Shino work, and so not everyone buys Shino work, and they're like, do you have this in blue? and and I'm like, no, no, I don't. And if it were blue, it wouldn't be in my booth. And so, there's this, I often struggle with this. One of the things that I try to focus on is maintaining, regardless of what's going around me, is what I am interested in. And I'm excited about seeing other artists and what they're bringing into the conversation. And there is some work that I just absolutely love, but I would never ever do or ever make or even consider making. And I'm okay with that. And I think that's what creates this really interesting diaspora of work that we can all engage with. If everyone was doing Shino work, or if I was always doing blue work, then Shino really wouldn't exist at that particular show. So I, you know, I, it's interesting because I'm in this space where I'm encouraging my students to go out and research and find other artists and look for, other things to basically copy and bring in, because their learning process, their learning experience, they're learning how to apply design, you know, and that's fine. But at the same time, they begin to start honing in on the things that they actually like. And it's those things that I really try to promote and develop. And that's when I find that people are most happy with the work that they're making. And, honesty about yourself, honesty about what you're interested in. It's okay if it's not making it on the cover of Ceramics Monthly, or if it's not being recognized for an award at the latest craft show. What's most important to me is that it's something I can use, something that I enjoy, and something that reflects who I am. So I really, really relate to your description and your formula of honesty.
Kind of get off with that a little bit is that I don't know if many of people know, because this is not a fun incident, that there was this two big incidents going on in ceramics community in United States, that the studio manager or the director of Pottery Northwest just resigned because he was part of favoring white artists over by the colored artists. And also happened similar thing in Belger Crane Yards in Kansas City. And as a person of color or as a female, none of that really matters. But as a ceramic artist, I feel like everybody being honest to their work is important, because that brings diversity to the community. And that's what's making our community so great. But like, those things shouldn't really happen. But like, I'm glad that ceramic community is active enough to really abolish that. And like, even if you're in Nova Scotia or New York City or Istanbul, like, everybody hops in and say something about it. And I think that also kind of roots from like everyone being honest to their own statement that diversity matters. And even if your work doesn't revolve to that, like your personal statement is about that. And I just really appreciated that when I was seeing that.
Yeah, I can build on that, especially with the diversity thing, because when I was growing up, you just didn't see a whole lot of diversity in the craft movement. And um, we had some snowstorms here, and we had virtual classes, and so I put together some presentations on Roberta Lugo and Raven Half Moon. And Raven Half Moon is a sculptor that I just really fell in love with her work. But they're also commenting on these larger societal issues that you're bringing up, and I really think about what Roberto Lugo was saying, in that he's adding to the conversation. And that's something that I found most valuable, is that there's a whole segment of American history and American society that a lot of people have not experienced or engaged with. And discovering, and now that our society is hopefully making these strides and permanent changes, that now we're beginning to understand a lot of these different perspectives. And just like you said, it's adding a whole new perspective of what it means to live in America, or be a part of like our global community. Because really, we could get into the politics and the economy of these discussions, but really our world has shrunk tremendously, and we're really a global community. I mean, just think of, we're Zooming from all over the world these days. But, again, I find the value in looking at someone else's perspective. It helps me understand who I am and how I can be a better person. And I think the craft movement is long overdue in incorporating these types of artists. So, I'm not too familiar with the actual events that you were talking about, but if it's someone resigning because they're not dealing with, accepting other people's viewpoints, then I think that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and my work is about my identity as a person, and as a person who's Asian from Asia. I grew up in Korea, and I had thrown into this country that is a melting pot of different race, different backgrounds. And it was, at first, it was a shock for me for the racism part. Like, I came from Korea, where everywhere you look are Asians. And now I'm thrown into this country that's mixed with Asian, white, black, Latinas, or indigenous people. And that was one shock, that when I treat students, I have to understand where they're coming from when they say something. And another thing was that about LGBTQ community, that I was really not aware of when I was in Korea, because Korea's developing, but it's still a closed society, because it's in East Asia. And that was coming to grad school or coming to America was like my first exposure to LGBTQ community. I knew that they existed, but I never see it firsthand in Korea. So that was another thing that really made me want to stay in the United States and work, because I feel like those outside influence is shaping the person as who I am. And knowing what else I could have chosen, or what else I could have been, instead of being Asian or female or heterosexual, that's kind of like constructing the culture around me right now. So that's the reason why I believe in diversity matters. And another thing is that, this time, especially because of Trump, this country had been divided so much more than ever. And as a South Korean national, it's absurd to see this and witness this happen. And it's so interesting. Well, it's really sad that the same thing is happening in our our community of ceramics as well. That how one stupid political figure could wreck up the whole society, including even the art community as well. So I don't know why I got so rampant about this, but yeah, that's one thing that I wanted to mention.
Well, it's an important topic, and it's like you said, it's these questions and these experiences have infiltrated everywhere in society, especially in America. And I was honestly surprised, as you were, as how divided things can become. And those are the types of things, and we're getting a little off topic, but those are the types of things that I think you hear a lot from media sources. But when I'm in my community, when I'm in my neighborhood, I think one of the saving graces is that, especially in this area, and when I moved to this area, I had been exposed to so many different types of cultures to the DC area that I just never would have even considered, growing up in Pennsylvania. And I find that that experience in itself has been such an enriching, element of my human experience, and has been such a benefit to not only who I am as an artist, but who I am as a person, and how I can translate my knowledge to anyone who comes into my classroom or anyone who comes into my exhibition. And one of the things, I guess what I was trying to get to is one of the things that gives me hope is that in our community, I don't see that division on my block. And when I'm talking to my neighbors and I'm going out, there seems to be kind of a unity that's still there, that I can still grasp onto. And hopefully, as we move forward in time, we can solve these issues as a society and move on and create a better place for us all to be and to have a better conversation. And I hope that this becomes worth it. Those are just some, personal experience, um, uh, observations that I've made. So, I'm not saying that I'm right or wrong, but that's definitely just from my perspective. So anyways, do you have anything you want to add, Ara?
No, I guess that's it. That was actually very fruitful for me too, just to talk to someone else who is on the board with me, that diversity matters, and this is what we stand for as an artist as well. And I also wanted to mention to the students that your work matters because your work matters, not because you're minority. Like, you being a minority doesn't really play anything to your work unless you're making something about your own identity. Like, your work has to be good, and then it follows. But because last time I was talking about this, about my identity, and in that conversation it kind of led to me being a feminist artist. But my work is not about feminism. My work is not about that. My work is about me, not about just feminist. And it's just really easy to go on to that topic because that topic is so popular right now, and like, it's so in that you just want to dip into that a little more. But I just want everybody to know that it was about that, not this lecture was not about diversity.
Yeah, we just fell on that topic, but I think that's a really important topic. And, we have to have the confidence in each other to have these conversations, and these conversations are really important right now. And so, for me, I think that's a great place to end. We've hit our 90 minutes, so that, woohoo. So I guess I would like to end with thanking everyone for coming, everyone from the community. I really appreciate you guys coming in. Please, pass the information on, and please join us for our next Fuse lecture series, which will host Judith Varga. That's going to be March 19th at 10:30 a.m. I just threw in a link to the MU Fine Arts Fuse page where you can find all of the information. I'll also be, I've recorded this, so I'm going to pop it up on our Marymount Fine Arts YouTube channel, so that if you want to go back and check it out, you're more than welcome to, or share it to anyone in your community. And I guess I'd like to just again thank Ara for coming and giving such a great presentation, and having such a great and I think heartfelt conversation. So
Thank you for inviting me, Joe. I really enjoyed the time.
all right, well, thanks again, Ara, and I can't wait to see you in person.
Yeah, me too. Bye.
I'll see you over at District Clay.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Bye.
Okay, I'll see you guys.